So I'm very happy to welcome everyone to this week's SIAT Spring Speaker Series, which is produced by our Graduate Research Colloquium. And we are very happy to welcome Dr. Matthew Pelowski today. So before we begin, I'm just going to open with a short land acknowledgement, acknowledging the territory that I'm working on today and that I'm recording this session on. So at Simon Fraser University, we live and work on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And today I'm in Surrey, British Columbia, on the unceded traditional territories of the Katzie, Kwantlen, Coquitlam, Kikite, Musqueam, Tsawwassen, and numerous Stolo nations. So thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I am going to hand things over to Christy Shao. Christy is a graduate student in our program, and she's going to be introducing Dr. Pelowski. Take it away, Christy.
All right, thank you, Kate. So thank you for everybody coming to today. I'm going to introduce Dr. Matthew Pelowski is an assistant professor of psychology and neuroaesthetics at the University of Vienna, a part of the Vienna Cognitive Science Hub, and leads the Artists Lab/project, which stands for Art and Research on Transformations of Individuals and Societies. He has a background in both fine arts as an active artist and also in humanities and social sciences. He completed his PhD at Nagoya University in Japan and did postdocs at both Nagoya University and University of Vienna using behavioral, psychological, and neuroimaging methods, exploring human interaction with art, and published over 40 papers in leading journals in empirical aesthetics of art and ecological museum studies. For the artist project specifically, they conducted studies that document thousands of people's reaction to visual art across Europe and aim to understand the emotional aftermath of art encounters. They employ sophisticated methods like latent profile analysis and movement tracking to identify shared pattern and correlations between movement and depth of insight. Beyond aesthetics, the project explores how changes in art presentations, such as lighting, influence emotional responses. And most recently, the lab has working on project about Parkinson's disease and artistic creativity. So I met Matthew a few years ago at an International Association of Empirical Aesthetics conference, and we had some common collaborators as well. Those experiences has greatly shaped me and inspired me today being a student here at SIAT. So let's welcome Matthew, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey,
Thank you so much, Christy.
Let's see.
Thank you, Matthew. Yes.
Try to share my screen, and in the meantime, can everyone hear me okay? Should I speak up, or this is okay? Cool. Just a moment. How do I do this? There we go. And that looks okay. Cool.
Looks
okay.
Great.
So first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure. It's I got to find a little bit out about your institute after I had received this invitation and did some Googling, and it seems amazing. I'd like to hear more from you guys, and hopefully we can do that in the question and answer portion. But yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and a little bit about Vienna, and then kind of an overview of I guess the broad sketch of a main project that I've been interested in for many years, and it's sort of guiding at least a portion of what we're doing, and hopefully what we'll be doing into the future. And yeah, this is the title, but I think it was up there. A bit about myself. I won't go into details because of the very nice introduction, but suffice to say, I'm assistant professor of cognitive neuroaesthetics at University of Vienna. I'm from Nebraska, which I've been giving talks to non-North Americans for quite a while. So I usually preface this with, has anyone ever heard of Nebraska? I'm hoping maybe you have. I mean, most Americans couldn't find it on a map, but hey, And the way I would introduce where I'm from is to say, if you drive in from the east, this is what it says, and this is what it looks like, and this is about where I'm from. And if you drive in from the west, from Colorado, which is, I think, a much more interesting state, this is what you get. And I think that sort of sums up the I don't know, the zeitgeist of where I'm from. It's a very nice place to be from, I think. But it's also one of the reasons that I've sort of traveled around and sought out other experiences. But yeah, I actually have a background in art making. That was my first love. I have a BFA in oil painting, and I also studied advertising way back in undergrad in Nebraska, and then got further and further into I think an interest in art theory and art philosophy and art criticism. I'll talk a little bit about some of the, I guess I could call them gateway drugs or gateway books that sort of led me down the path I'm in now. And then, as was mentioned, eventually I found my way in Japan, where I was in a Department of Information Science. So I think to some extent, maybe closer to what you guys are doing, much fewer artists, but people interested in human-computer interactions or information design or using technology. Sadly, in my talk today, I won't really get into much of that. It's more sort of general, how do we respond to art? But I'm happy to talk about it as well. And since 2020, I had the opportunity to become an assistant professor. I was actually in Vienna for several years before that, and started the Artist Lab. And yeah, this is the Artist Lab. This is what we do. I think it does what it says on the tin. So we're really interested in, especially the aspect of transformative experience, how art can shape us and change us, and maybe sometimes be used as a vehicle for, addressing societal challenges, for helping people explore how we fit into society or how we interact with each other, or, how we could even be more adjusted or healthier people. And just a little side note about Vienna. The reason I'm here is because of this. It is, or it was, the world's first faculty of psychology that had a specific research focus, which was on the webpage. I'm not sure if it's there anymore, with a focus on empirical art and aesthetics. So it was really, in 2004, it was established by my ex-boss, now colleague, good friend, Helmut Leder, who had the bright idea when he was interviewing for this professorship to say, I want to build a seat focused on art and aesthetics research. And for years and years, it's really been one of the places that has a critical mass of people who are interested in doing this sort of research. It's a really exciting place to be, and it's really dynamic. If anyone's interested in a trip to Vienna or a research stay or a visit, by all means, reach out. Yeah. And since I've had the opportunity to set up a lab, and actually a few others have set up smaller labs of their own, we've rebranded to also the EVA Labs, which is Empirical Visual Aesthetics Labs. This was Helmut's original lab, and now I'm a co-director of this as well. I think last time we counted, we had about 30 people from something like 15 countries. Yeah, it's a really fun place, and doing a lot of research on all of the different facets of art. Yeah, so that's sort of the spiel of where I'm from. As far as what we do, this is more what I do. So I would boil down the sort of research I'm interested in to, at its core, investigating the nuance, the ecologically valid, and the emotionally or cognitively complex experience of art and all of its implications. And as far as my lab, we sort of have split this into two streams, which are my goal is to get them closer and closer until they cross. And the first is art and individual and society. And we do a lot of museum studies, a lot of looking into art in everyday life, using, as was mentioned, a mix of different behavioral, physiological, experience sampling methods. We're getting more and more into the pragmatic applications, a lot of collaborations with artists as well. And then also, especially late in my PhD and in some of my postdoc work, I had the opportunity to move more and more into the brain side of things, especially using some techniques for mobile brain imaging. I think I have one slide that just has a picture about that today, but by all means, ask a question if you're interested. But yeah, looking at especially art as a vehicle for social interactions, looking at, say, emotion sharing through art or performance pieces and how an artist and a viewer might sync up. And then also this aspect of creativity and especially neurodegeneration and the way changes in our bodies and our brains and our lives can map onto changes in the way we make art or even our interest in making art. But yeah, so for today, sorry, I'm really going to talk about the first one and just sort of the overall view of what we're doing and you know, what I think is interesting about this. So that sort of brings us back to, I think, a very basic question, which manifests in many different ways, but I would boil it down to this, because I think it's sort of a nice way of encapsulating what I'm responding to, but also where we hope to go. It's a quote by the British Minister for Arts, Estelle Morris, said in 2003. And it's, "I know that the arts and culture make a contribution to health, to education, to crime reduction, to strong communities, to the nation's well-being, but I don't know how to evaluate it or describe it." And what I hope to sort of show you today is this is very much, I think, still the case. It's been the case for a long time, and it's, I think, more or less why my field exists, and I hope it's what we would hope to respond to. And I think it really speaks to an interesting and exciting time for how science or especially psychology can play a role in addressing the arts and also as a good collaboration partner. Okay, so this is my sort of spiel of why I think arts are interesting. I hope I'm preaching to the choir of why I think it's interesting to research and why it's such a present aspect of society, and even why a cultural minister would say this. And I guess I could ask you guys why you think art is interesting too, but this is what I would say, among many other things. So first of all, maybe it's emotionally, or if not emotionally, maybe it's evolutionarily distinct. You could have a really rich discussion about, you know, if a gorilla sticks a stick into an anthill and uses it to fish out ants and then eats them, is that philosophically any different from art making? You know, or a puffer fish makes concentric circles on the seafloor. Is that art? You know, are we all just conditioning our environments to be more beneficial to us in various ways? I don't know, but there are arguments that art is something that really makes humans human. It's also the focus of culture, of civic resources, of public spaces, which is getting more into, I guess, what we're working on. I think this is a bit outdated now, but in 2014, reviews showed or suggested that at least 50 museums worldwide had over 1 million yearly visits. I can say Vienna, for example, we do a lot of work in a museum called the Albertina and also the Belvedere, and they have roughly 600,000 to 1 million visitors every year. I'm sure in North America, it's many more, depending on, you know, what city you're in. Hold on, redirect page. There we go. And then also, I think this blends into where I am particularly interested in this, which is if you think about it as a psychological experience, the way we engage art, the way we interact with art and what it does to us is a complex, a nuanced, and also sort of a multifaceted psychological, physiological, you could say, body experience. And if you just think about, you know, the rich scope of art that is around us, and these are just paintings or just 2D works, and think about, you know, what can happen when we're standing before it and what can manifest. Of course, art is tied to a wide range of emotions, to perceptions. It can guide the way we see things. It can bring us to new insights. It can be a vehicle for making meaning, for making associations, of course, appraisals for finding beauty. It's also, I think, fascinating for raising questions about our social interactions with each other or with artists or with our society. Of course, it raises very interesting questions about the body. And also at the base of art experiences and writing around art, there's also an ever-present discussion of profound experiences. And this is really where I have come into this topic. First of all, does anyone know what this is or who it's by? I would tell you this is the reason I'm in a department of psychology now, 20 years later, after being interested in this. No one knows? Someone's in the chat. Hold on. I can't read it.
Is it a Rothko? Someone's asking.
It's a Rothko. Yep. It's a Rothko. It's from the Rothko Chapel, which is a very unfortunate name, which is not actually a chapel. In Houston, Texas, there's actually 14 of them. It's a giant purple painting. But what's really interesting about it is, and actually, if you're looking for a good book to read, an art historian, James Elkins at the Art Institute of Chicago, wrote a book called Pictures and Tears. And he has an argument where he says that of all people who have cried over 20th century art, the majority have done so here with these paintings. And I remember I read this book just at the end of my undergrad when I was getting more and more into, what does art do to us as opposed to how do we make art that does things to other people or to ourselves. And I was thinking, well, that's fascinating. How could a giant purple painting that doesn't move and doesn't change make us cry? And if you dig into some of the critics or the critical discourse about what is going on, they say things like, well, eventually you're looking and then you sort of lose the meaning and you find yourself alone in front of the painting. And then the art forces disturbing questions about ourselves, and the experiential structure of how we're engaging in this art is transformed. And if you go to the chapel, which I actually did during my master's years and years ago, you can find a visitor's guide, or not visitor's guides, visitors' books where you can leave a note for the artist or for the institution. And you find things like find yourself. And again, I think as a psychologist now, I would call myself that. And then at that time as an artist, I thought this was fascinating. Like if something is happening here, and if we're being led to tears, and if this is art is making us find ourselves, it has to be happening in ourselves. It happens in our brains. It happens in the way we're seeing art and seeing ourselves and seeing the world, because it doesn't move, it doesn't change, but somehow it's so powerful. And this is not the only example. Art writing and art discourse is just rich with belletristic examples. Anyone know? Actually, it says Fred Sandbeck, so I won't ask you who made it. But there's a very nice essay by Andrea Fraser, who is an artist, talking about some Fred Sandbeck pieces. Again, these are just, he makes sculptures with string in the gallery, sort of delineating this 3D empty negative space. And she wrote an article called Why Does Fred Sandbeck Make Me Cry? And she talks about going into this gallery and looking at these pieces sort of swaying in the air conditioning. And she says, I was struck by how reduced the art was. They were so still. I started to feel that art is an impossibility. And if art is impossible, then artists are impossible. She's an artist. And I am impossible, at least not as what I am. And then she talks about, starting to weep in the gallery. And she turned and looked at the docent in the corner, and the docent sort of said, like, don't worry, it happens all the time. It happens to a lot of people, just relax. And again, how is it that, a piece of string can make us break down and cry and question our livelihood and what it means to be an artist even? It doesn't even just have to be transformation. Of course, you can talk about wonder, resonance, harmony. This is a piece by Oliver Eliasson, which was in the Tate Modern several years ago. Another example I like to use, I'm assuming most people in the room know who painted this. Kandinsky, it's by Kandinsky. There's a really nice anecdote by Kandinsky. He talks about coming home late at night into his sort of dark studio space. And he said, I returned home, I was absorbed in the work I had completed, and suddenly I saw an indescribably beautiful picture pervaded by an inner glow. I stopped short, and then I approached this mysterious picture on which I could discern only forms and colors. And he talks about standing, just transfixed in the middle of his studio, staring at this amazing thing across the room. And he slowly approached it, and he realized it was his own painting upside down, leaning against the wall. And he talks about trying to duplicate this experience. He would leave another painting upside down against the wall and go out and come back, or have a drink, or spin around, and try to have the same experience. And he says, I never had it again. I could never get this again. Another more modern example, pieces by James Turrell are connected in a lot of writing and our critical discourse to the same sort of reactions. This harmonious, resonant loss of self. It doesn't have to be big examples, of course. I think one of the really exciting things about art is it can give us a little tweak of novelty, or a little insight into the way we see the world, or question a little bit about why we're here. The example on the right side is one of my favorite. It's by Barbara Kruger. I think it's hanging in the entrance to the Cincinnati Museum of Art, which basically asks people when they come to the museum, why are you here? And then it gives sort of pithy reasons, I'm a tourist and I think I should come here, or I think art is good for me. Questioning people like, why did you even come here today? And what do you hope to get out of this? Of course, it doesn't have to be just visual art. It could be music, it could be theater, it could be eating a Madeleine and then being transported back to, I guess, when you were 14 years old and you were talking to your aunt, if you've ever read Proust. It doesn't have to be positive, it could be negative. This is one of my favorite examples by Andres Serrano, which was attacked by a very angry person with a hammer in 2011 in a museum in France. And of course, you could say, well, it's a photograph of a crucifix in a jar of urine. It's a very beautiful photograph if you perceive it that way. And so you could imagine why it would make someone so angry and so ready to attack it with a hammer. But still, it's an unmoving photograph. It doesn't necessarily demand anything of anyone unless you bring something to this encounter. So that sort of takes us to the what I would say the shared question, or the shared aspect, which I hinted at in my title. Another very good book, if you want a nice book to read, by Bjarne Funch, The Psychology of Art Appreciation. He says, well, we've probably all had some kind of notable aesthetic experience. Perhaps a piece of music, a landscape, a ritual, something else. This is one of our most shared human responses and the basis for our interest in the arts. And really, for me, this is the question we're trying to get at, is can we understand this? Can we tease it apart? And of course, on top of that, then you can build all sorts of pragmatic applications. If the arts are doing this to us, maybe it can be a vehicle for we can direct it to some end. Can we change feelings? Can we modify the way people are feeling? Can we modify their well-being? At least in my field, and we're getting more and more into arts and culture and social prescribing and these sort of topics. A scoping review came out in 2019, which really has, I think, set the tone of engagement with art does seem to be good for us. It does seem to impact our well-being. You can also talk about, can art be used to change people? So I think this gets more into the transformative experience. So this is a piece by Olafur Eliasson, where they transported pieces of an iceberg and put them in front of various, I think, houses of parliament across Europe as a way of raising awareness about climate change. Maybe the anthropologist or the social scientists of the room or philosophers could say like, well, there's a lot of questions about what is the carbon footprint of, hacking off a piece of an iceberg and shipping it across the ocean to put it in front of a House of Parliament to change people's attitudes about climate change. And is this really the best way to do this? And other examples, for example, Ai Weiwei, this is life jackets that washed up on the shore of, I think, Cyprus by individuals trying to leave North Africa and make their way to Europe. That were displayed around the columns of the concert house in Berlin. There's many other examples. In Minnesota recently, there was a first museum that was focused on empathy. Another example that I like to use is by Wolfgang Tillmans, which was an anti-Brexit campaign. And okay, so that takes us to some questions. So if we think that art can do this, and we think that there's so many rich, interesting things that art can be used to impact us, or ways it can impact us, how do we explain these reactions? How do we organize? How do we assess and understand the collection of factors in art experience? How do we contrast or compare individual responses? And I think this is really a guiding question for what we're trying to do in psychology, but also for arts in general. If we could get answers to these questions, I think it would really unlock some interesting things we could do. And at the same time, we also have to be mindful, how does all this really interesting stuff connect to what probably typically happens when we're engaging art? Does anyone have any idea what the average time people spend usually in front of one painting in a major museum anywhere in the world, or at least in the Western world, is? No idea. About 11 to 40 seconds in general. So you sort of have to say, okay, well, how do we connect that to, having your mind blown by a purple painting, or weeping in a gallery because of string, or, having this out of body experience? Okay, so that takes us to the but, which is sort of where I'm coming in. But especially in the empirical studies of arts, these were the sort of questions we really couldn't answer. We couldn't really get at. And I think this goes back to how art is usually assessed, or was usually assessed traditionally. So if you think of, what is a typical art engagement, this might be the sort of default image you have in your head. Someone goes and they stand in front of a painting, maybe in a museum, and they, engage with the art, or they look at it and they get something from it. But if you think about how it's usually studied, it looks more something like this. You sit in a room, usually in the basement or in the top floor of a building of psychology, and you look at some digital reproductions of paintings on a screen, and you push some buttons. If you're in an MRI, maybe you're lying on your back with headphones, looking at a mirror above your head, which is projecting an image that is shown on a computer behind your head. And typically the sort of questions that we're being asked is something like this. So, did you like it? Was it good? Is it pretty? And of course, even this example on the left side may not be how we actually see art. I think the person's head here, it's Fergie. So she had really good access in the Louvre to the Mona Lisa. Typically, it might be something like this, which also raises another layer of questions of, what's going on here? And if you think about how art experience was typically explained, this is one of the first models of art experience, which is not important, but you can sort of boil it down to a very basic idea of art perception, which is basically based on theories of vision. And we would say we look, we group some things together, we put it into sort of a gestalt, we identify the things in it, that's a dog, and that's a chair, and those are some people. We look some more, and then if that all goes well, we maybe feel good and we like it. And the more we can understand it, or the more fluently we can process it, the better. And that's sort of the idea of what an art experience is. Of course, it raises all sorts of questions like, how do we change? How do we find something new? How do we loop back? How do we have our minds blown? And this sort of boils down to the sort of results we're getting out of studies of art, which is, for example, this was a meta review of 93 studies of aesthetic experiences across different domains of music, visual arts, theater, I think food. And they basically found, okay, is there some part of the brain that responds to art across all of these cases? And what they essentially found was a bit of activity in the medial orbital frontal cortex, which is on the right side here, this little yellow dot, which is basically pleasure. So anytime you do anything pleasurable, this part of your brain would be active, which tells us, we like art and we respond to it positively, but that's it, because of the paradigms we've been using and the questions we've been asking, which then leads to very serious questions about what are we even doing? Can you study art? Why should artists even open up their art to study if this is all we can say about it? And not to mention, how do we even talk about art that changes our minds or changes our attitudes? That's off the map of research, which of course leads to questions such as, well, if we have no evidence that the arts can do anything, and we don't even know how to study it, maybe they don't do anything, and maybe it's not worth spending resources on, and maybe we should stop funding it. Which goes back to Estelle Morris and this quote, I don't know how to evaluate it or describe it. And that's really what we're trying to do and what I'm trying to do. And so with I'm doing okay. With my remaining time, I'd like to tell you about what we're trying to do to answer this question and to really talk at this idea of, can we start to explain what the arts are doing? Can we come up with better ways of assessing it? Can we go into ecologically valid situations? And then can we talk about what it could do or the impacts it could have and why and what those conditions are? And as was mentioned, a lot of this research has been driven by Horizon 2020 project, which is a major European-wide funding scheme on societal challenges in the arts. So just before COVID, so 2018, 2019, the EU basically put out a call saying we need data on the societal transformative potential of art. Can the arts actually be used for this? How do we even begin to study this? And this is a consortium project we put together. I'm leading it with many different partners across Europe, including art schools, to really try to answer these questions. And basically what at the core of what we're trying to do is to come up with some different tools. So first of all, can we start to theoretically model art experience? And can we model it in a more nuanced, complex way that can talk to some of these more profound, but also maybe mundane outcomes? And then can we use it as a basis for empirical study to understand and to quantify what's happening in our engagements with art? And then, of course, can we work with artists, designers, curators, policymakers to really articulate and apply art's transformative potential? Okay, so what do we do? First of all, as I said, this was basically my master's and my PhD years and years ago, was trying to come up with better models of art experience. And it started with a model for specifically transformative outcomes. And then after I came to Vienna, we put out an updated model called the VMAP, which is the Vienna Integrated Model of Processes in Art Perception. And my aim was basically to come up with a way of speaking to what are the main outcomes that could happen for anyone with any work of art. And then how can we use this as a way to understand and assess art experience? And I know you can't see it and it's not really important, but just to give you an idea of sort of our working theoretical framework, we basically posit several stages that people might go through. And the argument would be that these are more or less universal. So first of all, before you ever see art, you have some sort of pre-state. Who am I? What is art? How does art relate to me? What am I bringing to my encounter? What have I done over my life? And you can actually put this into a model. This is an idea by a psychologist called Carver, where he basically talks about the sense of self, and you can have a hierarchical self. And he says at the core of this sense of self, we have what are called B goals, which are, basically self-actualization. Who am I? Who should I be? And then branching out from this, we have do goals. What should I do in a particular situation? They get farther and farther away, and sort of determine everything that we expect and we perceive and the actions we might take. And the key point is we basically try to preserve the sense of self as much as we can. And the farther things are out on the periphery, the less important they are, and maybe the easier they are to change. So we sort of take all of this baggage with us, and then we come across a work of art. And basically then, we follow some standard steps that have actually been modeled before. So we might apply this schema, we might, identify different things, we put it all together, we understand it, we assign meaning. But then the really important question is what happens next? So we engage art, we have an idea of what it means, we perceive it, we might like it a little bit, and then what do we do with it? And here in psychology, we could argue that there's some key cognitive checks, we call them, that kind of can be used as a way of determining all the different reactions we might have. And there's two key ones, which is self-relevance. How much does this actually relate to me? Do I care? And schema congruence. How much does this artwork fit my expectations? Is it questioning something about myself? Is it showing me something new? Or does it perfectly match what I expected or hope to see? And based on the answers to this, you can only almost use these as binary gates to determine these different outcomes. So for example, if I have low congruence, or excuse me, if I have low self interest, I don't care, and I have high congruence, I see what I expected to see. This would be the standard way of responding to art. So we sort of see something, we don't look very hard, we pass on in the gallery, nothing happens. At the same time, you might have low self-engagement, but also it doesn't really match your expectations. And this is when you might have novelty or a little bit of bemusement or insight. Or it could be cases where something about the world and something about the art really does resonate with yourself. It does have deep importance to you. Maybe you don't know why, but it also really matches what you brought to this encounter. And this is where we talk about flow experiences, or, something about art just dropping into place and everything just being perfect in the world for maybe a fleeting moment. And then you can talk about cases where I care, I'm deeply vested in what I'm doing, but it doesn't match what I want the world to be. And here, one of two things can happen. Basically, we go into what psychologists call a stage of secondary control. Humans are really good at escaping situations that are questioning them and questioning themselves. And you might devalue, you might physically or emotionally escape, you might blame someone else. And the key is not to let this really change me or question me. And this is where we get a very negative outcome. Or in some cases, we might be trapped and we can't escape and we have to stick it out. We have to cope and we have to find a new solution. And this is where we would argue that people eventually sort of their experience is forced back on themselves, and they maybe become very self-aware. They sort of have a metacognitive experience. They start thinking about, what am I doing? What did I expect? And you might then be able to change something about the way you're engaging. You might find a new solution. And this is where we really talk about a transformative experience. And essentially what this would be is you're changing something about the schema, which sort of has a run to a core aspect of yourself. And this would be a way that art could be transformative. So basically, if you take anything from this, I would say the model key points would be, it gives us the basic outcome for how we can understand art experience. It posits maybe 5-ish ways that we could respond to art, or anything for that matter. And the argument would be that this should happen below the level of who, what, where. So you can really talk about probabilities. So given one person and one work of art, when they engage a particular artwork, maybe they're most likely to have a certain type of experience, and another person would have a different type. But theoretically, anyone could have any sort of experience with art. And then even more exciting, this gives us a roadmap of different factors or aspects we can look for. So what we try to do is tie to all of these different stages and outcomes, various aspects. So for example, what emotions would people report? What sort of physiological responses would their bodies show? What sort of appraisals would they give you? And you can really start to talk about, based on the collection of these different features, we might be able to understand what sort of experience they had. So for example, if you want to talk about what is the difference between having a really negative experience and a transformative experience, we would say like, well, at some point, you're probably challenged and you're confused. You might feel anxiety and you might stop there, and that would be negative. But then you might also, have this feeling of self-awareness and awareness of your body and a need to examine motives. And then eventually you might have insight and epiphany and relief and catharsis. And you might answer all of those. If I say, how was your experience? What did it feel like? You might say, well, I felt bad, but then I felt good, and I thought about myself, and then I felt changed. And this gives us the basis for how we then go into the museum and start assessing art experience. So what does this look like in practice? So for years and years, we've been using this as a basis to go into museums and to look at people's experiences. I'll just give you a few examples, but my favorite example is back to the Rothko Chapel. I had the opportunity to go and to look at this. And so this is what it looks like again. And basically, we had argued that we'll probably find one of three reactions. Either nothing will happen, or it'll be really negative. People will get really angry because the literature suggested this, or maybe it'll be transformative. And so what I did is I spent a nice summer in Texas, sitting at this little bench here and asking people before they went into the museum, hey, would you participate? Would you do a little pre-test? And then just go in there, do whatever you want to do, come back, and then answer some questions for me. And what we did was we asked people about their emotions. So when you are in this space, how did it feel? So for example, when I was in the room, I felt. And then what we argued was, okay, if we take a few of these main emotions, we might be able to sort of tease out these different pathways that people would go through. So we had confused, anxiety, self-aware, and epiphany. And then we looked at what sort of reports we got from people. And quite happily, we found evidence for all three of these experience types. So either, this is the gray one, people would say, I felt nothing. Nothing happened, I felt nothing. Or they would say, yeah, I felt all the bad stuff. I felt confused and anxious and none of the self-awareness and insight. Or, as I had hoped, they would report all of the above. And then you can look at, okay, well, what does that say about the implications of the art experience? Well, people who have this transformative experience feel that the art was better, it was good. They understood the intention of the artist. They felt like crying. They also gave an assessment of the meaning of the art in terms of what it did to them and not what it was. So they wouldn't say it's a purple painting. They would say, I think the point of the artist was to make me reflect on, how I was feeling and what I was expecting. And I think that was the point. You can also look at impacts such as, does this change our sense of self? And one of the techniques we used before they went in and after they came out was to have them very quickly answer these questions. So I would say, don't think and just answer spontaneously, I am. So I am good, bad. I am happy, sad. I am hot, cold. And we find that when people have a transformative experience, they say, I'm better, I'm more serious, I'm more complex. Whereas if you don't, you almost had a worse sense of self coming out of this encounter. And then you can also look at different situations. So for example, we looked at the same kind of Rothko rooms in Houston, in Tokyo, in the Tate, and we looked at, do we find the same patterns? Do we find the same incidence of these outcomes? And we do. So there does seem to be some argument for a cross-cultural consistency here. Okay, so then how am I doing with time? Am I more or less okay? Okay. So then you can say, cool, we can identify experience. Now what can we do with that? And for me, then it gets really exciting, because then you can start talking about all of the different specific features of art. So what about context? What about personality? What about design? Can we change and modify these sort of experiences? And just to give you, again, one example, one of the things we noticed when we were comparing against in these 3 Rothko rooms, now 2 of them are red and 1 of them are purple, that might be a difference. But in the Japan room, for whatever reason, the profiles were the same, but the incidence of transformative outcomes was a little bit lower, and the negative outcomes were a little bit higher. And we went back and started looking at the data and thinking about why might this be? And the only difference we could find was people tended to say, I was really aware of other people in the room, more so than in these other spaces. And actually, I went back and I pretended to be an art student making sketches of the paintings, and I made little maps of every person as they were entering and engaging this space. And it happened to be a really small room, and you could almost perfectly determine where people would walk and how many paintings they would see, depending on where people were sitting in the space. So if you're sitting on a bench and you're looking to the left, everyone goes right. And if you're sitting on the bench looking right, everyone goes left. And then when you come around the corner and you come face to face with the docent in the corner who's making sure you're not touching the paintings, everyone leaves. And you could connect this actually to some nice social psychology, talking about social anxiety and this idea that when we're entering a room, we sort of check who else is in there, and we think about, do I belong here as much as everyone else? And if the answer is no, you might want to avoid these social situations. And you can also look in some writing on architecture and say, well, if you want to avoid a social situation, you need a certain amount of space between a seated person on a bench and someone who's walking. I think it's 14 feet, if I remember right. And this was just impossible. You would unavoidably go into a social interaction. So what we did is we talked to the curators. They were actually remodeling the space anyway, and they made the room bigger. They made the bench smaller, and now actually it matched this argument for enough space to walk around without engaging a social interaction. And we went back and we said, okay, nothing changed except for the size of the room. Let's look at these outcomes. And we actually find that yes, by just changing the design of this gallery space, the incidence of transformative experiences went up to about the same level as we'd found it in the other spaces. Negative went down. So something just as simple as this can have a profound impact on the sort of experiences people are having. And of course, you can talk about all sorts of other exciting things. So for example, what about movement? Does movement have some relation to the experiences we're having? So this is a paper we put out, I think last year. We used a Microsoft Xbox Connect to triangulate people as they were walking around a gallery space. We used mobile eye tracking, so they knew they were being eye tracked, but they didn't know that their walking patterns were being measured. And we can make heat maps of, where do they look? Where do they walk? But more interestingly, we could then say, okay, well, let's look at, do they report insight, or do they say the art was good? And how does this map onto where they stand in the gallery, or where they stand before art? And even more, this was now she's a doctor, but a PhD student of mine at the time made these walking profiles for every single person. And she used some different techniques, especially from animal research, to sort of quantify these different movement profiles. And we found 4. And then you could say, okay, cool. How does this relate to, say, transformative experiences? And we found that one particular walking pattern where you go down the middle, then you make a T in front of the art, and you go back and forth, tended to predict people who were going to have transformative or insightful experiences. So if you walk a certain way, it seems to suggest that you're going to have these sort of experience types, or maybe vice versa. We just actually did another study looking at installation piece with some of the same questions. And for example, found that people who become very aware of their bodies when they're climbing on this net, and also very aware of the way they're moving their bodies, tended to report more transformative, insightful experiences. You can also, I think Christy mentioned lighting. You can look at lighting. So we recently did a study looking at a triptych by Hieronymus Bosch. And we're working with a lighting designer who had installed this 30 spotlit, what she would argue would be best practice lighting arrangement to showcase this piece. And we did a study where we used this lighting arrangement or the default lighting arrangement. And we wanted to see, does this have any impact on people's experiences if you don't tell them and they don't know that the lighting could change. And actually we find it really doesn't. It didn't have much impact. People are really good at ignoring the lighting. And we found this a couple of times. You can also talk about implications of art experience. So for example, what about art that is changing our attitudes about climate change? So this is a study we did in Berlin. It was in the middle of Corona, so it was set up on the corner of a gallery and you could look in. It was about gold mining in Venezuela and how that was destroying the environment. It was a mixed media piece. This was us standing in the very cold Berlin winter, asking people to fill out surveys. And then we could look at, okay, does it have an impact on people? And yes, it does. Just engaging with this installation made people more aware of their relationship to nature. We also looked at, there's this battery called Nature and Self, and you just ask people very simply, like, which of these circles best represents your relationship to nature? Like, are you overlapping or are you completely separate? And one of the things we found, and this is common for a lot of this sort of transformative or socially focused art, people after an exhibition would tend to say, you know what, I'm not as engaged or overlapping with nature as I thought I was. But then you can go back to the experience type and you can say, well, actually people who have a transformative experience are more likely to say, you know what, I'm not as connected to nature as I thought I was. And this might be a seed then to thinking about this and to future improvement. This is actually what the artist wanted to happen from this experience. You can also look at well-being. So this is again in the middle of COVID, but what if we just send people to Google Arts and Culture and we have them look at one Monet exhibition? Does that make you feel better? Actually, it does. It reduces anxiety, loneliness, well-being. We found repeatedly that it only takes about 100 seconds to have this impact. You can also compare to the gallery. So we've been doing several studies with this. But again, you can also go back to the sort of experiences. So here we find with Monet's, it's not really transformative, it's harmonious. People have a very resonant, harmonious experience. And this seems to be the best path to making them feel better. We actually had the crazy idea, well, maybe having a harmonious experience would also change people's attitudes or change their minds. Maybe, you know, you would go into the gallery and you would see beauty and you would say, you know what, humans are great. They can make things like this. I should be more pro-social. I should care more about the environment. So we tried this again using the same sort of approach. And no, it doesn't work. Absolutely no impact on. It'll make you feel better, but it will not make you more pro-social or more environmentally aware, at least in this study. We've also done a lot of work now. We're getting into VR and making comparisons. Okay. Can I steal 10 more minutes? Am I okay? Or should I wrap up? Okay. So last thing I want to show you is something that we just sort of wrapped up. And I think what is a nice conclusion for these approaches we've been doing, which is basically saying, okay, let's go from these one site, you know, one-off studies of one particular artwork or one particular installation. And can we go back to the shared and the sort of universal question of art experience? This is a project we've been doing for several years. Steph is a PhD in the lab. Catherine Cotter is in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project at University of Pennsylvania. And the idea was to collect a quote unquote representative sample of art and of art viewers, which is of course impossible and incredibly hard, but I'll say how we try to do it. And then assess their unique experiences with a very wide range of phenomenal states. So basically, how did that feel? And then the idea would be to take all of these art experiences and combine them into one map. So basically across all people and all art, this is what art experience looks like. And then to say, can we find some shared patterns? So what we did is we said, well, we can't do it by style. We can't do it by historical period. We can't do it by genre. So we came up with 3 axes for a representative sample of art, which was meaning. So it was either very conceptual or very direct. It is what it is. Valence, so it's sort of positive or negative. And style, it's very abstract or it's very mimetic. And we tried to sort of get a range of art that covered this entire space. It was the best approach we could come up with. We ended up doing 32 artworks. Yeah, did a lot of work in Albertina, historical pieces in the Belvedere. We did some work in Art Institute of Chicago. This is a conceptual piece by Gonzalez Torres. I had to throw in a Sandback because I wanted to know. So we got a Fred Sandback. We did a Rothko. We did data collections in the Venice Biennale, in Documenta. We did an installation by Anselm Kiefer in the Palazzo Ducale in Venice, massive paintings. We also, of course, I was teaching an internship class and we gave our students the assignment to collect a lot of data for us. And one of the assignments was go into the Albertina and find a painting of an old white man. Because we wanted, sort of the mundane default art experience. This is this is Steph, who's a PhD, and the students in this is, I believe, the Albertina Modern. We came up with, this is our phenomenal space. So we came up with 90 distinct feelings that people might have, which was based on the literature and based on sort of as wide a net as we could cast about what could art do to people. And then we put it all together. So we ended up collecting about 2,740 individual people's unique experiences of one of these works of art. And you can make what's called a network model. So it basically takes all of these feelings and it puts them all together. And it says, this is how these different feelings relate. And you can also talk about different communities. So, some of them sort of go together more than others. But then based on this, and if anyone's interested in the math, there's your citation. But based on this, then you can sort of take some of these emotions on this map of all art experience that are the best predictors. So basically, if we know the answer to these ones, we should be able to know how people would answer everything else. And you can run what's called a latent profile analysis. So it basically runs thousands and thousands of iterations across these patterns or across all of this data looking for shared patterns. And the question is, can we find some shared patterns that sort of define everybody? And we actually did, and we found 5, and I'm very happy they match very nicely to the model. So basically, these are the core emotions at the bottom. So that if you want to know something about people's art experiences, these are the 16 questions to ask. Did you feel love? Did you feel pleasure, playful, moved, change of self, engaged, bored, sad, transformation? So we found one which was neutral. So they basically feel nothing except for bored. We find one that is negative. They feel all the bad stuff. We find one which is harmony. We find one that is transformative. So they feel the bad stuff, but also moved, change of self, engaged, thrill. And we also found a novel one. So they sort of feel some insight. They feel all the good, but they don't feel any of the bad. And what's exciting about this is you can classify every one of these 2,700 people into one of these distinct experience types. And you could say, okay, based on this answering pattern, you had this type of experience. And then, of course, then you can go back and you can look at the different types of art. So you can say, well, the ratios change. So happily, the sandbag, quite transformative. The Monet, very harmonious. Most people have harmonious, but still you can find some people, nothing happened, or some people get really angry at it. Neutral, yeah. The old white man does basically nothing for about 2/3 of the people. And then you can go back to the implications. So you can say, okay, based on these different experience types, what does that tell us about your appreciation of art? So for example, if you want art to be meaningful, basically anything can happen as long as nothing happens. It's meaningful if it's bad, if it's negative, it's meaningful if it's transformational, it's meaningful if it's harmonious. If you want people to like it, maybe they should have, the more harmonious, insightful and transformative experiences. You can also ask people, did the art experience make you feel better? And here, you would say, well, harmony is the way to go. If you want to make people a better person, then maybe transformation is better. If you want people to change something about yourself, then transformation is the way to go. And then finally, the last thing I will just say is what we're setting up now is these 16 items, we're making a web app. So basically, in the future, you should be able to ask people just these 16 questions and put them on this calculator online, and it will tell you what sort of experience someone has, a new person with a new work of art. And this, we're kind of using this as a tool going forward. So for example, what about murals in the city? Or what about scanning people's brains as they're walking through the art? Can we connect what happens in your brain to certain types of experience? Okay. So to conclude, yes, we can consider and even connect the profound or transformative or otherwise engaging potential of art. Yes, this can be captured and assessed, but there's so much more we can be doing going forward. This is just the beginning. And I'm super happy to answer questions. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't take all of the time.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for your talk. Yes, you're going to see people actually clapping and making little clap emojis as well here on Zoom. So Matthew, thank you so much. Okay, that's great. So now is our time to open up for questions. And of course, I encourage people to either just maybe raise their hand virtually, and then we'll see a little queue, or you're also welcome to type your questions into the chat. I'll give people just a second to raise their hands or type into the chat. And while we're doing that, shall I start things off with a question? Okay, Matthew, I have sort of an unformed question for you, but I was just, as you were sharing your work, I was just reflecting on how I was this morning reading about how WordPress, as a web platform, has just changed its terms of service. So they're now using people's images and text for training data models for AI models. And I was, feeling a little bit ambivalent about that. And I was just also thinking about the Ellison, iceberg artwork and what that, and the kind of quandary that you raised around the cost of making that work, and what that means for people's awareness of climate change versus its actual cost. So, and given what we were talking about with our schools, we have a lot of artists, but we also have people who are researching and doing all kinds of interesting work using artificial intelligence. I feel like perhaps your work is priming some kind of machine to, create the sort of optimal art experience. And I wonder if you could reflect on your own interest or ambivalence around how our ability to track faces and emotions and all kinds of valences might be taking us in a certain direction at this point in time.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I can, and I would be really interested in answering. I mean, there's the technology aspect, but there's also, I think, one of the more basic discussions we have quite often, especially as I'm working with artists or philosophers of art as well, of, a lot of what we're talking about here is it can be very normative in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's sort of, in a scale, well, anytime you model or you quantify, you're adding value, and you're suggesting there's certain paths that are better, or or if you want them to happen, you have to set up certain conditions that would get you there. And this is really one thing where we're struggling with a lot, and discussing, this could very well be, I mean, one of the take-home messages of our data set could be, well, just look at Monet's. That's, it's safe, nothing bad can happen, it'll make you feel good, maybe you'll get a little insight. And that's the only thing art should be, for example. That's what artists should be mass producing, because it's better for society. Of course, getting into the technology aspect, maybe that's sort of where we're going as well, to say, well, how can we should we be using technology to produce certain types of art that are, just keys fitting in certain locks, for example. I know I wasn't involved with it, but a study by one of the other groups in Vienna just wrapped up, where they were looking at putting art in the city, and they wanted to know, can it make people feel better? And they actually ran a study where they worked with artists and they commissioned art pieces and they installed them, and it didn't work very well. And so then in a follow-up, they said, well, why don't we just use, like DALL-E, and we'll just work with the individual participants and we'll make an artwork which is ideal for them.
Mm.
And that works much better, I can tell you. It raises all sorts of questions about what are we doing, and is that art, and and so yeah, I think that is there's just so many new questions in the last even 2 years that we're going to have to be navigating and talking about. We do quite a lot of work with machine learning. It's more to try to distill out, if there's particular patterns in the art that is made by different individuals, which would tell us something about the individuals. So can we, for example, if I ask you to make a drawing and I put it in the computer, can the computer tell me if you have autism, for example? To boil it down to a very basic way of putting that. And then, of course, what does that tell us about, what's going on in your body and your brain? And for us, that's more the sort of questions we're interested in. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested to hear you guys as well. Like, what do you think about AI and where we're going and what it means for art making?
Oh yeah, I'm sure people have thoughts. Absolutely. Okay, so I see Patty has her hand up. So go ahead, Patty, and let's see where the conversation goes.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Pelowski. It's super interesting for me. In the late 90s and early 2000s, I was involved with John Falk and Deborah Perry's work on visitor memories and learning. And so at that time, I worked at the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, but I was in Washington, D.C. and Chicago with them. And we were looking at the impact of interpretive materials on the experience of learning. And so we actually had artwork out, and we had a number of interpretive pieces, and we would work with our visitors to pick out how they could connect to a piece that was foreign to them somehow, but what would make them more curious about either a complex contemporary piece or something else. And so we learned that providing information about the artist helped people connect and spend more time and contemplate more. And so I wonder if any of the work you've done has been done through that lens of, those helpers, if you will, being present for the experiencer.
Sure. Thanks for the question, first of all. That's really fascinating. Yeah, three things come to my mind really quickly. And hopefully I'll remember them all. First of all, we often do ask, for example, did you read the labels? We try to avoid audio guides or, because we really want to control what we can control for the most part. I have yet to find any impact from having read or not read the labels on what we're doing, which always sort of surprises me. At the same time, we have done a few studies trying to modify the sort of information people have. I know more widely in Vienna, there's been a lot of work that they've done with, metaphorical labels with abstract art or descriptive labels, and people, for example, responded much more positively to metaphorical labels because it sort of gave you well, it became a game, I think, sort of how do I match this to that? And I think also, I forget who the writer is, talks about sometimes the label is sort of like a life preserver. People cling to the side of the pool, when they're in a gallery, they don't want to let go and stand in front of the art just by themselves. So I know there's a lot of discussion around that, and we did a study in the Albertina a few years ago, again with Monet, because they were having a retrospective. And it was supposed to be a retrospective where the whole point was Monet was a radical, and his work anticipated abstract expressionism. And so what we did is we looked at one painting, which happens to be the water lilies, which is always in the Albertina, and it's usually in a room with some other impressionist art. It's a big donation by one donor, so they have like a gallery with just the art that was donated by this one individual, and there's a room with flower paintings basically. But in this retrospective, it was in like the 6th room as you were going through this journey of Monet's life, and it was in the room that was supposed to be like looking forward, looking to the future and modernism and abstract expressionism. And we were working with a social psychologist who had done this in the train station before, just showing people, say, like 3 paintings and saying, what do you think about the artist? And so we sort of duplicated that, but stood in front of the Monet and said, hey, look at this. What do you think of the artist? And, how much do you like this painting? And we found that by changing the curatorial context of where and when this was displayed, people said, oh, it's transformative. The artist is really deviant. It's really powerful. And of course, nothing changes except for where this artwork happens to be. So I think you can definitely make really interesting impacts, and it can really be something you can play with. And there's so much more to be done there as well. And just the last thing I would say is both ourselves, but also, I don't know if you know Becky Chamberlain in Goldsmiths University, who's running a master's course on art and neuroaesthetics, and is also a great place to go to a master's. And ourselves, we've been doing a lot of work trying to say, well, can we put some sort of intervention before people go into a museum space that would help them get more rewarding impacts out of it, especially at the level of like eudaimonic well-being and we've tried various things of, mindfulness activities or aesthetic looking activities or slow looking activities. And we've yet to find something that works, which surprises us constantly. So if anyone has a great idea there, and that's something that could be tried too. Like what can unlock some of the reflective and therapeutic aspects of art, or does it already work so well that you can't really add much to it? I don't know if that answers your question or talks around your question, but yeah.
No, thank you so much.
It was a great question. I really appreciate thinking about this from the curatorial perspective and the exhibition design perspective. There's so much to consider, and it's really impactful to see what some changes in the design of the space mean for people's ability to connect, and think of all the lost opportunities people have had because of the exhibition design. Other questions? I thought I saw Maya's hand up briefly. Does anyone have another question for Dr. Pelowski? Or any thoughts about AI images?
I do have a question, if that's still okay for me to ask.
Of course.
So I'm really intrigued by the work that you've done to identify the reactions, especially the intricacy of the labeling and people's experience. And I'm curious about what kind of work went into the emotional granularity around this. So I'm just trying to sort of connect the work that you're doing with the work that Brene Brown is doing in terms of the nuances that people have around being able to explain what their emotional reactions are to things
That's a
and
really
what
interesting question. Yeah.
of vocabulary
Hmm.
impacting the ways that they're able to describe their experiences. And that if that could be some of the pre-work that's done is to provide some of, I mean, I'm sorry to be trite, but she is a really well regarded sociologist. So I feel like I'm not just sort of saying someone who's a celebrity. But I'm just curious about that, whether or not anyone in your scope or in your field has mapping that concept around our human limitations, especially generational limitations, because I that generations that wrote long, elaborate letters,
Sure.
generations that are writing in concise,
Sure.
limited communication. There's a disconnect, I think, sometimes in the ability to describe the emotional nuance that you're experiencing.
It's a great question. I would say, so the work we're doing, it is informed by both work in our own group, but also some papers that have come before. So there's been, quite a lot of writing on different reactions people might have to art. And there's been quite a lot of work done before us. So for example, Paul Scherer and Minninghaus, where they sort of tried to come at that, where they would give people, large, huge lists of different feelings, and they would ask them, do you associate these to art? Do you not associate these to art? Or using them, in applied situations. So, okay, did you feel these ways? And I would say that there's been a lot of pruning along that path and ourselves as well. So, the first thing you would do is you would look for, well, A, do people say, I don't know what this means, or I don't really know what to do with this? B, there's, if you do it with enough items, there's always a lot of redundancy. So people tend to, I agree with you. You get to the level of just adjectives, and people are just sort of saying like, yeah, it was that, but it was also that, and I don't really know what the difference between those are. So I would say that the final list we came up with was based on, multiple iterations by that point, where we really tried to choose individual items that might have originally come from, a cluster of 10 different phenomenal states that people might or might not be able to make micro distinctions between. And I think really by the time we got to the 90 items, it was, they were really quite distinct. We did run and we looked at redundancy in our own work, and I think we ended up tossing something like 7 of the 90 that just, two of them, it didn't matter which one you chose, people sort of answered both equally. There were a couple items we threw out because just it was clear that no one knew what to do with it because they would come up and ask. So I am pretty confident that, of course, there's the cultural question of like, what do you mean when you say, I felt sublime, or I felt anger, or, not, maybe anger is not a good example, but that's of course a question. Yeah.
And no, it's
I'm
just
sorry?
interesting to me because the numbers are so close. You're talking about 90, and she's talking about 87.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you from fields
I
would
think,
number that humans are capable and interested in understanding, in that emotional granularity is quite intriguing. And if we're moving, like taking this one step further, I'm just curious about when we're talking about the complexity of our feelings around something that's in the wicked problem domain, like climate change, right?
Sure.
That's an interesting field to think about. How can art intervene in our ability to
Sure.
ourselves when we're feeling conflicted and when we're feeling nuanced, just about life, right? So thank you very much. I appreciate you answering the
No, totally. Just to say one point to the last comment you made. You know, even right now, climate change focused art is really driving the field, at least in psychology, of, you know, can art make something happen? And even now there's been a handful of studies saying like, well, maybe guilt is the way to go, or maybe it's not the way to go, or maybe shame, or maybe, you know, and I think even that there's quite a lot of conflicting evidence in, should you definitely not make people feel shame, or should you make them feel guilt instead of shame, or does it matter, or should it be positive? Even in that space, there seems to be a lot of conflicting evidence and reports, and it might even get at this aspect of, you know, these micro distinctions between these different feelings, and is there some artist who finds the right way to sort of guide us down this fraught path of reflecting on ourselves, thinking, changing without being defensive?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I know here in Western Canada, quite a number of the universities, especially at the undergraduate level, you know, art is now the space for safety. It's a space for cultural safety, and it's a space for sort of having these complex, nuanced conversations in ways where there is no judgment and there is no shame, but you are talk about the depth of your reactions to climate change or to the impact in your life. So, you know, if nothing else, that would be a wonderful experience for all of us. Thank you.
No, thank you for your question.
Thanks so much. I see Christy's hand up.
Hi. Okay, I'm just going to lower my hand. So first of all, I do share the similar like background with you, Matthew, about cognitive science, psychology, neuroimaging, behavioral studies of art, and luckily I'm currently in a lab that doing AI generative artwork. So I do want to say something about like generative art and research on like human experience and generative art. So I know there's other members in my lab doing research on how to generate like transforming like photo portraits to like artistic forms with different emotions in onto this portrait work. We use like emotional views, like similar to when you are doing some emotional mapping, and also like, but it's divided by quadrant, like positive, negative, and adventurous, or yeah, similar to that. So on the other side of it, we are trying to using AI technologies to generate artwork, portraits with those emotional elements. So when you were talking about, okay, you classify different works and people's experience based on their emotions, and like how combination of different theme or different emotional elements of the artwork can serve as a more art with more transformative power. So I wonder if your work or like your group has some thought on the backwards, like the generative aspect of like combining this emotional like experience, or if you have any advice, not only to practicing artists, but also to designers, like if I want to make my work has more power on like this transformative power, what should we do with our design practice or art practice? Because I am really interested in how can we incorporate our understanding of human cognition to design education or art education, for example.
Again, first of all, thanks for the question. Super interesting. Yeah, inescapably, a couple things pop into my mind. So maybe I'll start. So from the question of using emotion to create transformative experiences, you could totally do that. But I would argue that the way we're trying to use emotion, at least in that scope, is as an indicator of the cognitive processes that you're having. So I'm a advocate for the idea that emotions are sort of a way of checking in with yourself, and also they manifest and they tell us about what's going on under the surface, and especially in your engagement with the environment. So you could say like, well, if you want to identify a transformative experience, people should report confusion and anxiety and self-awareness, and then maybe eventually insight or reflection, right? But I don't know that you could just treat those as like, okay, let's make an artwork that like sort of shows those different emotions, because I think that's coming at it the wrong direction. You would have to say something about the artwork in the way it's questioning what you brought to the encounter causes confusion, or causes discrepancy, or causes, a tension, which you can report, you can feel, and you can report after the fact if I ask you. And then something else from a design perspective maybe keeps you from running away. And it could be in who you are and what you bring to the encounter. So, if you're an artist and I make a piece that questions art as a real thing, and then artists aren't real, maybe you sort of find yourself trapped and you say, well, I can't run away because art is important and I am an artist and I can't just dismiss the whole thing. But at the same time, if I have to sit here and engage with this thing that's questioning artists, I'm trapped. And I think that's a design question, but it's not an emotional question. You just might feel trapped. But you can't make art about being trapped. It would be a different, it might work for a different person, but yeah, and same for insight, and same for, catharsis, or even happiness. I think happiness in the context of a transformative experience would be, how you feel when you come out the other end. But it's the coming out the other end that is the cause of the happiness you might be feeling, if that's sort of getting at your question. At the same time, we have done quite a lot of work with AI generated art, and especially looking at, just the basic question of, do people have emotional responses if they know it's by a computer, or they've been told it's by AI? And even working, for example, with this question of agency and intentionality, like, would people report that they felt certain ways, and would they report that they think certain ways were intended for them to feel? And we actually find that it's pretty uniform whether people think it's AI generated or they think it's by an artist. Surprisingly, people report a lot of emotions. They even report like, I think I was supposed to feel this way, having been told this is by an AI, it's completely random. There is no intentionality, but people, I think, are just sort of conditioned to look for the intentionality and to respond emotionally to the environment. We're just writing up a study right now, even where we looked at the brain before you look at the art. And this is following a study that came out several years ago, where they told people, this is a famous artwork by a famous artist, or this is generated, I think it was with Photoshop in the lab, by, like a scientist. So it's computer generated art. And they looked at what happens in your brain before you even see it. And they found that in the real art by real artist condition, the pleasure parts of your brain were sort of active in anticipation of something that was going to be good. And so we thought, well, maybe, what about empathy? Like, if we look at the empathy parts of the brain and I say, we're going to show you an artwork, it's by a human, or we're going to show you an artwork, it's computer generated. Would like the empathy or the theory of mind come online in one case, but not the other? And no, they're equally the same in both cases. So I think humans are sort of conditioned to respond even to AI art. And I know there's, I'm thinking of like Sherry Turkle, or, some of the writing about how we respond to computers, which is not all that unlike how we respond to other humans, because we have about the same amount to work with in both cases.
Yeah, I think I read about like similar studies, probably older, like when we say about aesthetic experience, like context matter, like if it's an art gallery or on the computer. But I think like most recently people really emphasizing on the generative part of generative art, because if you think about computer generated, it's like code. But if about generative artists, they are like intentionalities from the person who used the generative tool that probably raise like this kind of equally experience.
Sure. Well, plus, you know, you're sort of the computer sort of dipping into the internet of, you know, like just
Yeah,
the
like
sea
other
of human culture is the basis for the generation or for the generative output as well. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Any other questions in the room?
Can I say something?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you to giving us this presentation. I think it's really interesting topic. For me, I think I was just fascinating to see artworks. I didn't think about the reason. And also your presentation remind me of the time, bring me back to the time that I was intern in Belvedere Museum. And at that time, I saw lots of exhibitions there. I went to the Albertina, Leopold Museum, also the museums, National Museum of History and Arts in the city center. I have to say, Vienna is the city with a good atmosphere of arts and museums. And I think about, also remind me about, they took the height of high-end artworks quite seriously. Because in the, I think it's in the Mozart Museum, I saw they have a two height of artworks. One is for adults and one is for children. I think this is quite good and thoughtful. And also about when I, instead of the painting acclimate case, I think the experience is quite different when you look at the pictures in the textbook. Also, they gave a copy, a copy of the case in the next room. So all the audience here could take photo in front of the fake painting. But for the real painting, there's lots of restriction. So it's different. I think this kind of experience, that virtual artworks couldn't replace. And also, I'm just thinking about, because I saw you do a lot of text on those like microscopes exhibitions in different locations, but that's in the real location, right? I was wondering, did you compare the results with the same collections but in the virtual space? Would that be different? But for me, whenever AI generate artworks or the virtual artworks, I think it's just kind of new experience. It couldn't replace the real human artworks. That's my opinion. Thank you. I would like to hear yours.
I think to the first question, no, it's very much something I want to do. So one of the next steps we're planning to do is to take the same artworks that we have, you know, this rich data on people's experiences in the actual museum and set up a standard online study or lab study where they come in and they look at the same artwork on the computer screen. But the reason I want to do that is it gets at the literature that's out there right now about, is there a difference between, you know, a digital reproduction and the real thing? And actually a researcher, a postdoc researcher in Vienna put out a meta review a few years ago, Eva Specker, looking at all of the comparison studies, you know, of like, oh, we ran a study in the museum and then we put it online or we put it on the lab. And they found that there was no difference between the two if you look across all the studies. the reason they think that there was no difference, and I totally agree with them, is because of the questions they were asking, which is usually, is it pretty and do you like it and is it interesting? I think humans are really good. I mean, there's it's something called the facsimile accommodation hypothesis, which is basically we're very good at looking through the presentation format, even if it's a bit, cloudy, and appraising the underlying thing, whatever that is. And we make appraisal if it's just do you like it, and make an appraisal. It doesn't really matter what the presentation format is, because we sort of look through all the noise to what we think is the signal. Having said that, I think it raises the questions of like, well, what about all the other questions that could be happening? Like, what about transformative experiences, or what about, having your mind blown, or what about like having this sense of, your body and feeling the weight of your legs as you're standing in front of a piece, and, hearing footsteps in the gallery, and all of these different, more, I think, interesting emotional questions or phenomenal questions, which have really not been looked at. So that's one of the things we want to dig into. And I would think if you would find a difference, I hope if you find a difference, that's where you would find it. But surprisingly, there's not a lot of research that has really started to dig into that, in a systematic fashion.
Thank you. Can I say the posters behind of you, that ones, I think I was there at that time. Yeah, I watched that exhibitions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
I love that. Thanks everyone for your questions. I think we have time for one more question, and that would be from Tiger.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Dr. Pelowski. Yes, my name is Tiger. So you mentioned one of your student was using like animal research to categorize like museum visitors into different classes. That just sounds very interesting to me. Like, did they use like some eye tracking device? I think you mentioned like Microsoft and stuff. So I'm coming from a cartography and like visual presentation specifically for maps background.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be very useful for me to improve my, virtual presentation in terms of maps. So like, would you mind to elaborate a little bit more over that? Yeah.
Yeah, actually doing some mapping is one we're really interested in getting into that, but more like citywide, and where is the art and how do people engage it. I don't want to say something wrong, but my memory is, so this is Coco Kunapfel, who was the lead author on this project. So the data itself was using these Microsoft Xboxes to triangulate and map how people are moving. I think it was about a 3.5 meter by 3.5 meter space. And, we could track with really good accuracy exactly where the center of gravity, where they were standing over the entire time they were in the gallery. And so that's what the data was. And she found some techniques. It's sort of similar actually to the network modeling that I showed at the end, where I believe it was say studies of wolf migration patterns, or like how wolves would walk through the forest, or and so using different movement metrics. So basically they had a standard list of like left-right movement, speed of movement, and you could quantify these different aspects for each individual, and then you could feed it into the computer, and you could look for shared patterns across these. And so it was sort of a cluster analysis to find, there's, I don't know, these 7 are the best predictors, and across these 7, we found 4 patterns that, best describe the data. So presumably you could use it for, a wider sort of mapping. I'm pretty sure that's been done. But also, if you're interested, shoot her an email as well, Karina Kunapfel, who's the lead author on that paper, and I'm sure she'd be super happy to explain it. She's in Berlin now, doing a postdoc, so, and interested in continuing down that road as well.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. That was very interesting.
Thank you, Tiger. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pelowski, for your talk today and all your generous and generative responses to our questions. And thanks everyone for your questions. I really enjoyed the conversation. And we just really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us and to share your really exciting work with us. So thank you so much. And let's all thank Dr. Pelowski. Virtual and
guys.
real clapping, yes. Thank you, everybody. So that brings us to the end of today's session. Next week, we're going to have a talk from Dr. Kimberly Phillips, who's the director of Simon Fraser University Galleries. And I think that's a really nice presentation to follow today's talk. Thanks so much, Dr. Pelowski. And thanks, everyone. See you next week.